All right, we're going to get into it. All right, once again, we are trying to do more of a lecture style. There's handouts in the back. Let's see, I haven't even been keeping track of how many weeks we have been in this study. Let me count up. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I think we're on 6 or 7. All the handouts are there in the back. Make sure you grab any that you've missed. Some weeks I have 2. I try to keep everything in the same spot, or the same slot back there in the holder. So if it's laying down, that's handout number 2. I do not have them dated. I've been trying to number them. As far as the page numbers, but I don't always remember to do that, and I didn't do that at the beginning. We should be on page 12 and 13, I believe. If I'm not counting the cover page. We are in Genesis chapter 12 this morning. Absolutely, the number 12. I definitely want to answer any questions, so do raise your hands if you have any or if you need any clarification. This is an important study for us to understand, and the lack of the understanding of this concept and of this topic has led to many a misunderstanding of the situation of today, much less of biblical times. So we've got an important topic to address today. Our study actually begins in Genesis chapter 11, starting in verse 27. I don't think many people realize this, but Terah's descendants. Now these are the generations of Terah. Terah fathered Abraham, Nabor, and Haran fathered Lot. Haran died in the presence of his father Terah in the land of his kindred in Ur of the Chaldees. Abraham and Nabor took wives. Abram's wife was Sarai, and Nabor's wife was Milcah. And the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah, was Issachar. Now Sarai was barren and had no children. Terah took Abram and his son, and Lot, the son of Haran, and his grandson Sarai, his daughter-in-law, and his son Abram's wife, and they forged forth together from Ur of the Chaldees to go to the land of Canaan. But when they came to Haran, they settled there. The days of Terah were 205. I am at the end, so verse 32. Yeah, so Terah died in Haran. All right, I do apologize for the bad reading. Reading is not my strong suit. I think a lot of times we forget that the generation of Terah, God had basically called Terah to come out of Ur of the Chaldees, to go to a new land, and he had taken his sons. He had taken Lot, and they had gone, but they had only made it as far as Haran before they settled, and that's where they just kind of made a home. We don't know a whole lot about that calling, and some of that is, I guess, conjecture, because we don't have it said, and God called Terah, but Terah was on his way to Canaan. He was on his way to that land when they came to the land there in Haran. Now that's confusing because Haran is both the name of, it would seem, possibly the oldest son, as well as the place that they settled. So we're talking about the same name. One's a place, one's a person. So that is slightly confusing. So they're on their way, they settle, they make a new home. We know from this previous story on the Tower of Babel that Abram is descendant of the group that would have stayed put after Babel. right? It's because they built the Tower of Babel. Everybody disperses out of that land. But of course, somebody gets to stay put. Somebody decides to hang out, and that would be the people who speak the same language as the king who's building Babel, right? To me, that makes sense. That would be the logical person who stays put is the one who's in charge, right? If you can't understand the guy who's yelling, barking orders, and heads start rolling because you're not understanding him, right? You've run off, you take off, and you find a new home, but everybody who speaks and understands him stays put. So Abram and his lineage end up staying put there in Ur, in this land around Babel, I guess because they would have spoken a very similar language to what the new king, or the king would have been speaking after all the languages get jumbled. So God calls a family out of these other families that have risen up. If you remember back to last week's study and looking kind of at the archaeology and the timeline of these kind of things, several thousand years have kind of passed. Or not, I guess not thousands of years, but hundreds of years have passed between the Tower of Babel and Abram and this call. So once again, we have kind of the same circular events going on, right? God creates the world good, and we rebel against him. The world goes down, 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 down to the point that God says, all right, it's time to wash the world clean. So he floods the earth. A few years go by, and a guy rises up and says, hey, I'm going to be king. I'm going to make something of myself. I'm going to be one of these great men of old. And God says, yeah, no. And he confuses the languages. We have kind of the second judgment and then the dispersion that goes on there. So we look further down the line as people continue this fall from God, this rebellion against God, and God picks out of the world a person, a family for himself to make a nation out of. So while other nations have been rising, God says, I'm going to call one man, one family to bear my name, to be my representative, to redeem mankind out of. And we see the genealogies that lead us to Abram. And that's what's recorded for us within the scriptures. So we get to Genesis chapter 12, and an interesting and important passage for us to remember, one to memorize, one to hide in your heart. Verse 1, the Lord said to Abram, go from your country, your kindred, your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and those who dishonor you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. So we have a number of things that is taking place here. God says, I'm going to make something of you. Follow me, obey me, come with me. He says, I'm going to make you into a great nation. A great number of people are going to come out of you. How old is Abraham at the time? He is 75 when God calls him here in Genesis chapter 12. At 75, his wife is, 10 years his junior? So she is 65, ripe age of having children, right? No? No, you guys don't want to start a family at 65? No, thank you. Okay. All right, so she's barren. He has no kids. And God says, I'm going to raise out of you a multitude. Out of you is going to be a nation. And Abraham kind of looks around at Sarai and him, and he goes, sure, let's do that, right? But Abram is a spry old guy, and he says, yeah, we'll do that, right? So they go to this land that God's going to promise to them. Now, he promises land, he promises people, he promises out of that land and people to create a nation, and that out of that nation, he's going to bless the whole world. So those are the four basic promises. So land and descendants, resulting in a nation, resulting in blessing the world. So those are the four promises that we have coming out of here. Now, if you jump down to Genesis chapter 15, and you look at 18 through 20, and I'm not going to try to read all these names, but you have all the ites. You have the description of the land promise that God is going to give to Abram. He says, I'm going to give you this land. I'm calling you to go to this land. And here's the land you're going to inherit. He says, from the river of Egypt to the great river Euphrates, and then he lists a number of nation states of these tribes, these groups of people who inhabit that land between those 2 points. Now, it's important to understand that on one side you have the sea, on the other side you have the desert. So that's the constraining geographical aspects to the east and the west. North you have the river Euphrates, and to the south you have the river of Egypt. Now, what is the river of Egypt? Everyone wants to go to the Nile. It's not the Nile. We think of the Nile because that's the great river of Egypt. But that's not the one that's being referred to here. In fact, it's a little wadi. You guys know what a wadi is? A wadi is a body of water or a river that sometimes goes dry. It can be a dry riverbed. Sometimes it surges, sometimes it doesn't. Depends on the time of year. That has traditionally been the northeastern boundary of Egypt, of kind of their boundary line. That's kind of their traditional boundary line. So that Wadi of Egypt, that river of Egypt, is being referred to as that river there. And there's a number of reasons why we know that that's the river that is under discussion, that we're not talking about something all the way down to the Nile that God is promising. One, because when God calls Moses and the people of Israel out of Egypt to the promised land, they are on the banks of the Nile. I'm going to send you off to the land of promise. Oh, look, go to the other side of the river. You're there. No, he says, I'm going to send you there, right? The other reason we know this is because of all the ites that are described therein. So I've included in the handout a map of all this because this really quickly gets very confusing. So on one of those maps, I have the general location of where the ites are. It's important to understand that we have Edom, just south of the Dead Sea, up in the river, or up in the hill country there. That was Esau's promised land. Esau was promised that land. We then have the Moabite land of Lot and his descendants who inhabited that. So those were kindred to Israel. And because of that, God had given to them a land. So that land was not to be taken. That was an inheritance. Now, at times, Israel would inherit and would control both of those lands, right? But that was not part of the land of promise. So basically, we have through the middle of the Dead Sea, it kind of skirts over to the desert, and it goes up to the river Euphrates. Now, the land of the Hittites that is up there next to the land of the Euphrates is not a land that Israel controlled very long. It is a land that was controlled by Solomon during his reign. He controlled that area extensively, but that was not a part of the land that was controlled by Israel to a great extent throughout their history. However, we need to let the scriptures define whether or not the land was indeed inherited, because that becomes the issue. The theology that I'm seeking to address this morning says that Israel did not inherit the land, that God did not fulfill his promise, and that is a day yet to come, and that one day God will give Israel back all the land that he promised, and they will inherit the land, the remnant will inherit the land, and then God can set up his kingdom on earth. I'm talking about dispensational premillennialism, if you want to give it its title in the theological world. That is not based in biblical truth, and I will go toe-to-toe on that. And if you are confused by that and you want to get into the weeds on that, I have a wonderful book we can sit down and study together. It's called the Bible, but I have a study book that goes along really well with it by a brother. In Joshua chapter 21, when the land is divided and it's given to the people, what does Joshua say? Joshua says, "Thus the Lord gave Israel all the land." How much? All. All means all. All the land to their fathers, and they took possession of it. And they settled there, and the Lord gave them rest on every side, just as he had sworn to their fathers. Not one of their enemies withstood them, for the Lord had given them all their enemies into their hands. Not one of the good promises of the Lord had he made to the house of Israel had failed to come to pass. So according to Joshua, are we waiting for a wonderful forward day when God's going to give them the whole land? No, they gave them the land. Now, we can go forward in time and we can see where all of this land is controlled by Solomon at the height of Israel's power. What happened immediately following Solomon's rule? His son took over, as sons do, and his son did a wonderful job of immediately fumbling the ball and dividing the kingdom. So you get the 10 tribes to the north, Israel, and then you get Judah and Benjamin to the south. And you have a divided Israel because of Solomon's rebellion against God and because of his son's rebellion against God. So you have a number of reasons why they then have problems. When we look at this theology that says that Israel did not inherit the land, we're seeking to bring about a heyday that has already come. The land was given. The specifications of what that land was given. And us today looking on a map, trying to give them desert land that nobody could inhabit, and us trying to give them the land of Egypt, and to give them all the land up to the great river Euphrates and give them all this vast land is not the point. And God made himself very clear in 70 AD when God destroyed the temple with all of its records and wiped Israel off the map. And I don't care what you call the current state of the nation of Israel today that was established in 1950, 1948, whatever it was, right after World War II, right? Yes, they are a Jewish people, but they are the descendants of Abraham, but that is not the nation promised in Scripture. God was very clear when he wiped his place of worship off the map, removed all the records of who the high priests and the priestly families were, and scattered them. So it's important that we understand that that's not what's being foretold. What was being foretold in Ezekiel and other places that the premillennialists will go is talking about the time of Christ. that the nation would come back, and they did come back. They did rebuild the temple. And the temple would be grand. And under Herod and his bribery of Israel through this wonderful building project that puffed himself up more than it did anything else, he expanded the Temple Mount to its grandest it had ever been. It surpassed Solomon's temple. Maybe not in as much gold, but in its scope and in its size and in its complexity. It surpassed the temple of Solomon, right? So that second reformatted temple, right, because you have it rebuilt under the remnant returning to the land, and then you have it being rebuilt under Herod to its grandeur. That's the temple that Jesus was in. And Jesus says the time is at hand. He was the Messiah. God did not fail to fulfill what he wanted to do. The concept that Israel rejected Christ, refused to make him king, and that God had to go to plan B, which is the age of the church, is ludicrous. I'm sorry, I'm ranting at this point. But it's a pet peeve of mine because it leads to a lot of bad theology. And it's very prevalent in Christianity today, and it's leading a lot of our brethren astray, thinking that we have no choice but to support Israel. I support them as an ally. I think they're a good ally. But that doesn't excuse war crime, right? And the concept that we can't, because the Bible says we can't critique them. I'm sorry, who are the prophets? What were the prophets doing? Weren't the prophets really critiquing Israel the whole time? Like, they don't get a free pass, right? Just because you want to create a kingdom upon this earth that requires the rebuilding of the temple. Like, it's bad theology, right? It's really bad theology. And if you want to unpack all that, like I said, I can study all that out with you. But it centers and its origin is right here in the defining of the land. And it's important that we understand that the land was indeed given. The land was promised and the land was given.
Well, when the Bible talks about a nation, creating a nation, what's a nation?
What is a nation? Good question. Okay, so a nation, you got to have people, right? You need people. Otherwise, you're ruling over sand. You need sand because the people need someplace to be, right? So you need land and you need people. There's one other element that you need in order to have a nation. You need to have a culture, but the culture is defined by law. Bureaucracy, that's right. Right? All that politics is relationship, right? Polite relationship, right? Instead of me walking up and being like, I need your ladder, right? We have small talk, right? It's politics. It's being polite, right? That's what it is, right? Sometimes it gets a little ridiculous because we have to have a ball and we have to have people over and we have to, and we do this dance and it gets a little ridiculous. But ultimately, politics is just being polite in the questions and the asking and the getting things done, right, with people. But you need a people, right? You need people, you need a place, and you need a law, something that binds them, a culture, right? So what we see in Exodus is God calling the people out, giving them a land, and giving them a law, and creating a nation. Right? Now that nation begins out as a confederacy of tribes that is then led by a bunch of different judges, right? So a judge will lead a couple tribes here and a couple tribes there. The book of Judges is really an interesting study because it's not talking about ruling the whole of the nation. right? It's ruling over a couple tribes over here and a couple tribes over there, and you have timelines that are overlapping, and it's real complicated. Eventually you get to them calling for a king. What does God say about them having a king? Don't do it. He's going to take all the good stuff. He's going to tax you, right? He's going to lead you down the wrong path. Don't do it. I'm your king. They say, but we want a king. So he gives them Saul, and then he gives them David, because Saul goes bad, and you have Solomon, but Solomon goes bad, and as a result you have a divided kingdom, and you then have kingdoms and lineages out of those two. Right. Connie, you had a question or a comment. Right. Right. So when you think about America's beginning, you think about Jamestown, right? And then you have the Plymouth colony, and they're just kind of like trying to ignore that the other one's there, right? And eventually they kind of join a cohort, and eventually you end up with a state, and right? It's similar. It's similar dichotomy, right? People are people, right? Regardless of what time frame you're looking at. So the nation of Israel rules over all the land under the kings, right? And then the divided kingdom. God tells them, and you look at, what is that, Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy 30, 31, 32. The covenant of blessing and cursing. God stands them between these two mountains and says, choose this day what you're going to do. On one side, I'm going to give you blessing. You follow me, you obey me, you let me lead you, I will bless you. You'll be at rest on every side. But if you rebel against me, I'm going to curse you. And you're not going to be able to withstand your enemies, because I'm going to bring it down on your head. And they choose the curse again and again and again. And God, in his forbearance, loves them, and even in the separation papers, right, of the Assyrian captivity, God says, I'm going to bring you back. And then when he divorces them under Babylon, he says, but I'm going to bring you back. And that remnant comes back, and they rebuild the temple. And they inherit the land, and they control the land. Not to the extent that they wanted, but that was due to their own rebellion. God was not bound by their rebellion. And God was faithful in sending Christ, and in a kingdom that he established that was not based upon land, but upon the rule and the reign of God, and the redeeming of all people. This is not a mistake. This was the plan. This was the plan. This is what the prophet spoke of. All right, I've ranted enough. When we look at Abram, we see a man who comes out of Ur of the Chaldees. He goes up to Haran. He comes down into Canaan, as God calls him to do so after he gives him this covenant of blessing and his call. But he gets to Canaan, and there's a famine, so he goes on down to Egypt, where he then dwells for a season. He's afraid of the people of Egypt, especially because his wife is so beautiful. Anyone else have that problem? I have a beautiful wife. I'm always afraid somebody's going to kill me because of that. Good man. Right, so he says that she's my sister, which is a half-truth. He allows her to be married off, but God protects Sarai, and she is given back to Abram, and he is sent out of the land. He's able to keep the bribes that the king gave him to get his sister, who's also his wife, and they go back to the land of Canaan. The whole way, God is blessing Abram, despite the fact that he is obviously not doing right. And this comes back to the narrative of Genesis. Genesis tells us what happened. It doesn't whitewash it. It doesn't make it perfect. It doesn't make it clean. You find me somebody to preach on and to teach on who is perfect in the Old Testament. I've studied for years and preached for years on the family out of the Bible. I'm yet to find a perfect family. Every one of them's got some some flaws. Right? So Abram, man of faith, right? But he's like, she's my sister, right? The text does not tell us that was wrong. God does not take the opportunity to chastise Abram for his decision. But we know it's wrong. The text concludes and assumes that you can think with your head and realize what he did was not helpful. We're dealing with a fallen man. But we have an unconditional covenant that is being given to Abraham. God does not demand anything of Abraham to receive the blessing other than to accept it by going. That's the only requirement. By him going, he's accepting that, and he continues to walk by that. One of the things, actually I'm not sure if I have this laid out as clearly as I have it in my notes. I had like a page or 2.5 pages of things I wanted to include, so I had to kind of cut things down. In Genesis chapter 12, Abram is 75. Abraham comes back from the land of Egypt. Abram and Lot have grown so great that they have to divide. Lot chooses the fertile plains around the Dead Sea and around the Sea of Galilee, where there's 7 cities of the plain. That includes Sodom and Gomorrah. So he goes down and he settles there. The wickedness of that place, we're not going to get there this morning, but the wickedness of that place is going to rise up to the point that God's going to have to deal with them before the people of Israel can deal with them. So we're going to have the destruction of the cities of the plain. And the result of that is that fertile land around there is going to be completely destroyed to the point that it is really barren the rest of its history. It's probably one of the main reasons it's so salt-filled today, and one of the reasons why it's so agriculturally destitute today is because of that, because of God's judgment of that land. We then have Abraham saving Lot, because the cities of the plain get attacked. Abram has a standing group of men who are going with him, who are faithful to him, who he is able to command, and that he's able to conquer this band of people who have destroyed these cities. He saves Lot. He runs into Melchizedek. Here's an interesting point theologically about what's recorded within the narrative. Because the scripture does not tell us from where Melchizedek came, it doesn't tell us who his parents are, it doesn't tell us his age or how he became priest, it doesn't tell us how he became king. It just says, and there was Melchizedek. He was the king of this city, and he was priest of God Most High. That's all it tells us. And Abram offered to him a tithe and worshiped and praised God for his victory over these kings and saving Lot. And that's all it tells us. And theologically, the writer of Hebrews will circle back around and say, in the same way that we don't know any of that information, he is a priest forever, right? Is the Hebrew writer saying that Melchizedek didn't die? No. He's saying in the same way that we don't have his birth or end date, so too Jesus is a priest in the order after the likeness of Melchizedek, who didn't have a beginning or an end, didn't have a father or a mother. In the same way that we have this Melchizedek figure, who is apparently greater than Abram, because Abram offered to him his tithes, allowed him to be his priest, that would make Melchizedek greater than Abram, the father of the faithful. Right, so the points revealed within the scripture become then the defining points that then define the theology. Does that make sense? I feel like I'm talking over everybody. I geeked out a second, I'm sorry. The scriptures give us information, right? It gives us facts and it doesn't give us facts, right? Theologically, the scriptures will circle back around to the facts and not facts given to build a theology upon. Okay? The scriptures will do this again when it comes to the seed of woman out of Genesis chapter 3. Right? That there will be a seed of woman. It doesn't say into seeds, meaning many, but into seed, singular. Right? The scriptures will once again go back to the text to define its theology out of what is recorded out of the situation. Following? Do I need to clarify again? Come talk to me. It's a broad topic, right? Okay, so going through his land, then we have Abraham superseding God's promise because he's not having any kids. Sarai is still barren. So Sarai gets this idea, well, let's have a surrogate. I got this slave. Let her be your wife. You take her as your wife. The kid she has will be deemed to me. Well, that causes all sorts of problems in the family. But God honors Ishmael as a descendant of Abram. Right? God will then come at the age of 86 and will renew his covenant with Abram and say, I'm going to bring the descendant through Sarai, which I told you. I don't know why you brought this Hagar into the situation. I'm going to bless you. Sarai laughs because at this point she is 76-ish, right? Which is, once again, ripe age for, beginning your family, right? And Sarai is like, yeah, whatever, right? Well, I guess, let's see. No, I did that wrong. Abram has Ishmael. It is at 99 that God comes back and renews this covenant. Ishmael is 13, so 13 years have passed. At 100, Abraham, his name will change. Abraham will have Isaac, and Sarai will have Isaac at 90, which is a wonderful age to start a family. You guys keep laughing at me. I don't know why that... Right? It is a little bit crazy, right? I want to make a point. When we think of Abraham and we think of his godliness and all of those things, we think of Abram having this wonderful, constant contact, constant relationship, constant dialogue with God. Right? God called Abraham and he went and God was talking to him and they were visiting, they were best friends and they were hanging out and Abraham did all these wonderful things and he was the father of the faithful and they had Isaac. Notice the timeline of when God is speaking to Abraham. He speaks to him at 75 and then it's crickets until 86. God says, still here, still going to do that promise. Abraham is like, really? Because right now it's the slave of my household. The head of my household is going to be this lead servant of mine. He's going to inherit all this. And God says, no, I'm going to be faithful. God comes back at 190, 90 and 100, right? And fulfills this promise. That's a lot of time. So when you feel like God's being silent in your life for a couple months, when you don't feel like God's speaking to you through the scriptures, or you feel like you're not sure what to do and you're like, hey God, I could really use some help here. Remember that Abraham also had great seasons of silence from God. Be comforted by that. Be comforted by that. Okay, so God promised a land. We've defined what the land is. We've defined the fact that God gave them that land. The reason that God gave them that land through conquest is because it was judgment upon those nations. The land of the city of the plains could not wait for that judgment because they had become so wicked, God dealt with them separate. Okay, that's the whole story of Sodom and Gomorrah. Now let's deal with the nation, or the descendants. We have Ishmael, who became the patriarch of the Arab people. Right? God gave him land. He made him into a great people. He was head of 12 tribes himself. We then have Isaac, who was a son of promise, who would go on to have 2 kids, twins. He'd mess them up royally because of favoritism, right? And we then end up with 2 nations that come out of that. We have the nation of Edom, and we have the nation of Israel. God's continuing to follow the nation of Israel, but after that, Abraham takes on a 3rd wife, apart from Hagar, after Sarai, and he has 6 kids with her. Now, he does not give them an inheritance. Isaac gets all the inheritance, but he gives them great gifts, great abundance during their lifetime, and he's very much a provider for them. So out of Abraham, we have 6, 7, 8 kids out of a guy who was called and barren at 75. By the end of his life, he had 8 kids, and he'd go on to have 1, 2, 3, at least 3 nations rise out of him. So God indeed is fulfilling of that. The blessing of the whole land, or the creation of the nation, we'll see in the story of the Exodus, and the people of Israel inheriting the land. The blessing of the whole world will come through the Messiah, the messianic line that the rest of the scriptures speak of in Jesus. That's the fulfillment of this unconditional promise made to Abram. I'm running out of time here, but I need to hit a couple other points here. And here I didn't think I had enough material. When God comes to Abram in Genesis chapter 15, he says, I need you to get a bull and a goat and a lamb and 2 turtle doves. And Abraham immediately knows what to do. God doesn't have to spell this out for him because this was a common practice. They were going to make a covenant. God was going to confirm his promise, his word, with an oath, with a binding contract that Abraham understood. So Abram takes these animals, he sacrifices them, he puts them on kind of this incline because then the blood runs down and pools together. And Abraham waits. The way this normally works is the greater, the king, comes to the lesser and says, I'm going to make a contract with you. Here's what I need you to do. And in response to what I'm asking you to do, I will offer you this. When we look at the promise and the covenant made there, God says, here's what I'm going to do for you. And he doesn't require anything of Abraham. And we see that in the fact that there's a boiling pot and a torch that then appear and pass through that blood. God's saying, I'm going to be both the promiser and the fulfiller of this covenant. I am going to uphold both sides. What would normally happen is the king would walk through and say, in the same way that the blood of these animals has fallen upon me, and in the same way that these animals have lost their lives, if I fail to uphold my covenant, you have the right to do this to me, what has been done to these animals. And then the lesser walks through and does the same thing. If I fail to uphold my end of this covenant, you can do to me as has been done to these animals. So here's God telling Abraham, I'm going to make your name great, and you're going to be a great nation, and I'm going to bless you, and I'm going to give you this land, and you're going to be an inheritor of all of this. And the only thing I really want of you is obedience and faithfulness. And Abraham's going, I don't know how I can be perfect. How am I going to uphold this? God's going to kill me, but I'm going to be faithful. I'm going to walk through this blood. And what does God do? He passes through once, and he passes through twice, and he says, Abraham, you don't have to. And we have an unconditional covenant that God makes. He seals it with a promise. Now what we're going to see when the nation of Israel, and this covenant will be passed down from father to son, from Abraham to Isaac from Isaac to Jacob to the 12 tribes. The 12 tribes will grow in Egypt and come out, and God will bring them out and say, I'm going to give you a conditional covenant. If you bless me, if you obey me, if you follow me, I will bless you. If you rebel against me, then I will take you out of the land. And they're given the land conditionally. And it's important that we understand that there is an unconditional covenant of the giving of the land. They will inherit it. They will become a nation. God will bless them. God will bring the Messiah through them. But he says, in order to keep the land, in order to receive my blessing, you have to be faithful. And they were not. And God, in his long suffering and in his forbearance, put up with them again and again and again and again, until he finally in AD 70 said, enough. The nation is no more. I have my church. And we have been grafted in. We are that Israel. We are the people who stand as a light to the nations, saying this is the way that God asks us to live. And it is also a covenant that is conditional upon our obedience, both in how we enter and being faithful until death. All right. Hopefully that's clear as mud. If you have any points that you want clarified or you have questions, let me know. I know we covered a lot of different topics, but I wanted to get through kind of the covenants that are given. I guess the last point I will make as we end, the covenant that is renewed in Genesis chapter 17 and the sign of circumcision is a token to a people who are born into a saved covenantal relationship. And we see that in the fact that if these male children are not circumcised on the 8th day, they're breaking covenant and cut off from their people. It's not that they're being brought into that covenant. They are under covenant. They're born into covenant. And if they fail to do that, then they're breaking that covenant. So circumcision is the sign in their flesh of the covenant that they are in and that they're born into. All right. Let's pray, and then you can come and ask me all sorts of questions, and I'll try to clarify. We have covered Genesis 12 through 17 technically today at a breakneck pace. We will try to cover 18 through, I forget where the story of Isaac takes place, but we'll kind of go through that. I'm going to be taking next week off, so I don't know if the next teacher is going to go ahead and cover the rest of Abraham's life or not. I've given them permission to do that, so we'll see. So, all right, let's pray. Father, I come before you today. I thank you so much for all that you do. I ask that you will bless us and that you'll keep us safe. Lord, help us to know that you are a keeper of your promises, that you are faithful, that we do not need to second guess you, that we do not need to question whether or not you are faithful. We know that you're faithful. We know that you are good and that you will give us all good things. Forgive us when we fall short. Forgive us when we fail to live up to your expectations. Help us to be your light to this fallen world and to love you through all things. We love you, Father. And it's in your Son's name I ask and pray. Amen.